Continuing Agesilaus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. But one of the elders, having the perusal of it, and finding it powerfully written, advised him to have a care of digging up Lysander again, and rather burying that oration in the grave with him. And this advice he wisely hearkened to, and hushed the whole thing up, and ever after forbore publicly to affront any of his adversaries, but took occasions of picking out the ringleaders, and sending them away upon foreign services. He thus had means for exposing the avarice and the injustice of many of them in their employments, and again, when they were by others brought into question, he made it his business to bring them off, obliging them by that means of enemies to become his friends, and so on by degrees left nothing remaining. I think that's the first incident of necromancy that we're talking about in the book, but Agesilaus, his fellow king, was under the disadvantage of being born of an exiled father, and himself young, modest, and inactive, meddled not much in affairs. Agesilaus took a course of gaining him over, and making him entirely tractable. According to the custom of Sparta, the kings, if they were in town, always dined together. This was Agesilaus's opportunity of dealing with Agesilaus, whom he found quick, as he himself was, in forming attachments for young men, and accordingly talked with him always on such subjects, joining in aiding him and acting as his confidant, such attachments in Sparta being entirely honorable. Well, whether they're approved of or not, honorable may not quite be the thing, but certainly not dignity is outside of the public opinion, because honor is the worldly approval, and attended always with lively feelings of modesty, love of virtue, and noble emulation, which is more said in Lycurgus's life. Modesty. You got somebody helping you have affairs here, but maybe, discreet about it, not breaking up and down the street and talking over the details and whatnot. Having thus established his power in the city, he easily obtained that his half-brother, Teleutius, might be chosen admiral, and thereupon making an expedition against the Corinthians, he made himself master of the long walls by land, through the assistance of his brother at sea, coming thus upon the Argives, who then held Corinth in the midst of their Isthmian festival. He made them fly from the sacrifice they had just commenced, and leaving all their festive provisions behind them, the exiled Corinthians that were in the Spartan army desired him to keep the feast and to preside in the celebration of it. This he refused, but gave them leave to carry on the solemnity if they pleased, and if he in the meantime stayed and guarded them. When Agesilaus marched off, the Argives returned and celebrated the games over again. When some who were victors before became victors a second time, others lost the prizes which before had been gained. Agesilaus thus made it clear to everybody that the Argives must, in their own eyes, have been guilty of great cowardice, since they set such a value on presiding at their games, and yet had not dared to fight for it. He himself was of the opinion that to keep a mean in such things was best. He he assisted at the sports and dances usual in his own country, and was always ready and eager to be present at the exercises, either the young men or of the girls. But things that many men used to be highly taken with, he seemed not at all to be concerned with. Calipides, the tragic actor, who had a great name in all Greece, was made much of, once met and saluted him, of which, when he found no notice taken, he confidently thrust himself into his train, expecting that Agesilaus would pay him some attention. But all that failed. He boldly accosted him and asked him whether he did not remember him. Agesilaus turned, and looking him in the face, "Are you not," said he, "Caripides the showman, being invited once to hear a man who admirably imitated the nightingale?" He declined, saying that he had heard the nightingale itself. Metacrates, the physician, having had great success in some desperate diseases, was by way of flattery called Jupiter. He was so vain as to take the name, and having occasion to write a letter to Agesilaus, thus addressed it: "Jupiter, Metacrates, to King Agesilaus, greeting." The king returned answer: "Agesilaus to Metacrates, health, and a sound mind." While Agesilaus was in the Corinthian territories, having just taken the Heraum, he was looking on a while his soldiers were carrying away the prisoners and the plunder, while the ambassadors from Thebes came to him to treat of peace. Having a great aversion for the city, thinking it then advantageous to his affairs publicly to slight them, he took the opportunity, and when not seen either to see them or hear them speak, but if on purpose to punish them in his pride, before they parted from him, messengers came with news of the complete slaughter of one of the Spartan divisions by Iphicrates, a greater disaster than had befallen them for many years, and that the more grievous because it was a choice regiment of full-armed Lacedaemonians, overthrown by a parcel of mere mercenary targeteers. Agesilaus leapt from his seat to go at once to the rescue, but found it too late, the business being over. He therefore returned to the Heraum and sent for the Theban ambassadors to give them audience. They now resolved to be even with him for the affront he gave them, and without speaking one word of the peace, only desired leave to go into Corinth. Agesilaus, irritated with this proposal, told them in scorn that if they were anxious to go and see how proud their friends were of their success, they should do it tomorrow with safety. Next morning, taking the ambassadors with them, he ravaged the Corinthian territories up to the very gates of the city, where, having made a stand and let the ambassadors see the Corinthians durst not come out to defend themselves, he dismissed them, then gathered up the small remainder of the shattered regiment. He marched homewards, always removing his camp before the day, always pitching his tents after night, that he might prevent their enemies among the Arcadians from taking any opportunity of insulting over their laws. After this, at the request of the Achaeans, he marched with them into Acarnania, and there collected great spoils, and defeated the Acarnanians in battle. The Achaeans would have persuaded him to keep his winter quarters there, to hinder the Acarnanians from sowing their corn, but he was of the contrary opinion, alleging that they would be more afraid of a war next summer, when their fields were sown, than they would be if they lay fallow. The event justified his opinion, for next summer, when the Achaeans began their expedition again, the Acarnanians immediately made peace with them, when Canaan and Pharnabazus with the Persian army, with the Persian navy, were grown masters of the sea, and had not only infested the coast of Laconia, but also rebuilt the walls of Athens at the cost of Pharnabazus. The Lacedaemonians thought fit to treat of peace with the king of Persia. To that end, they sent Antiochidus to Tiribazus, basely and wickedly betraying the Asiatic Greeks, on whose behalf Agesilaus had made the war. But no part of this dishonor fell upon Agesilaus, the whole being transacted by Antiochidus, who was his bitter enemy, and was urgent for peace upon any terms, because war was sure to increase his power and reputation. Nevertheless, once being told by way of reproach that the Lacedaemonians had gone over to the Medes, he replied, no, the Medes had come over to the Lacedaemonians, and when the Greeks were backward to submit to the agreement, he threatened them with war, unless they fulfilled the king of Persia's conditions, his particular end in this being to weaken the Thebans, for it was made one of the articles of peace of that country of Boeotia should be left independent. This feeling of his to Thebes appeared further afterwards, when Phoebidas, in full peace, most unjustifiably seized upon the Cadmea. The thing was much resented by all Greece, and not well liked by the Lacedaemonians themselves. Those especially who were enemies to Agesilaus required an account of the action, and by whose authority it was done. Laying the suspicion of it at his door, Agesilaus resolutely answered on behalf of the Phoebidas that the profitableness of the act was chiefly to be considered. If it were for the advantage of the Commonwealth, it was no matter whether it was done with or without authority. This was the more remarkable in him, because in his ordinary language he was always observed to be a great maintainer of justice, and would commend it as the chief of virtues, saying that valor without justice was useless, and if all the world were just, there would be no need of valor. When any would say to him, the great king will have it so, he would reply, how is he greater than I, unless he be jester, nobly and rightly taking, as a sort of royal measure of greatness, justice and not force. And thus, when, on the conclusion of the peace, the king of Persia wrote to Agesilaus, desiring a private friendship and relations of hospitality, he refused it, saying that the public friendship was enough. Whilst that lasted, there was no need of private. The public friendship was enough. While that lasted, there was no need of private. Yet in his acts, he was not constant to his doctrine, but sometimes out of ambition and sometimes out of private pique, he let himself be carried away, and particularly in this case of the Thebans, he not only saved Phoebidas, but persuaded the Lacedaemonians to take the fault upon themselves and to retain the Cadmea, putting a garrison into it, and put the government of Thebes into the hands of Archias and Leontidas, who had been betrayers of the castle to them. This excited strong suspicion that what Phoebidas did was by Agesilaus' order, which was corroborated by the after occurrences. For when the Thebans had expelled the garrison and asserted their liberty, he, accusing them of the murder of Archias and Leontidas, who indeed were tyrants, though in the name holding the office of Polemarchs, made war upon them, he sent Cleombrotus on that errand, who was now his fellow king in that place of Agesipolis, who was dead, excusing himself by reason of his age, for it was 40 years since he had first borne arms, and he was consequently exempt by the law. Meanwhile, the true reason was that he was ashamed, having so lately fought against tyranny in behalf of the Phaeacians, to fight now in defense of a tyranny against the Thebans. One Sphodrius of Lacedaemon of the contrary faction to Agesilaus was governor in Thespia, a bold and enterprising man, though he had perhaps more confidence than wisdom. This action of Phoebidas fired him, and incited his ambition to attempt some great enterprise, which might render him as famous as he perceived the taking of the Cadmea, and made Phoebidas the taking of the Cadmea. He thought the sudden capture of the Piraeus and the cutting off thereby of the Athenians from the sea would be a matter of far more glory. It is said, too, that Pelopidas and Melon, the chief captains of Boeotia, put him upon it, that they privately sent men to him, pretending to be of the Spartan faction, who, highly commending Sphodrias, filled him with a great opinion of himself, protesting him to be the only man in the world that was fit for so great an enterprise. Being thus stimulated, he could hold no longer, but hurried into an attempt as dishonorable and treacherous as that of the Cadmea, but executed with less valor and less success, for the day broke whilst he was yet in the Thriacian plain, whereas he designed the whole exploit to have been done in the night. As soon as the soldiers perceived the rays of light reflecting from the temples of Eleusis upon the first rising of the sun, it is said that their hearts failed them. Nay, he himself, when he saw that he could not have the benefit of the night, had not courage enough to go on with this enterprise, but having pillaged the country, he returned with shame to Thespia. An embassy was upon this sent from Athens to Sparta to complain of the breach of peace, but the ambassadors found their journey needless. Sphodrias being then under process by the magistrates of Sparta, Sphodrias durst not stay to expect judgment, when he found which he found would be capital, the city being highly incensed against him, and out of shame they felt at the business, and their desire to appear in the eyes of the Athenians as fellow sufferers in the wrong, rather than accomplices in it being done. This Sphodrias had a son of great beauty named Cleonomus, to whom Archidamus, the son of Agesilaus, was extremely attached. Archidamus, as became him, was concerned for the danger of his friend's father, but yet he durst not do anything openly for his assistance, he being one of the professed enemies of Agesilaus, but Cleonomus, having solicited him with tears about it, as knowing Agesilaus to be of all his father's enemies the most formidable, the young man for 2 or 3 days followed after his father with such fear and confusion that he durst not speak to him. At last, the day of sentence being at hand, he ventured to tell him that Cleonomus had entreated him to intercede for his father. Agesilaus, though well aware of the love between the 2 young men, yet did not prohibit it, because Cleonomus, from his earliest years, have been looked upon as a youth of very great promise, yet he gave not his son any kind or hopeful answer in that case. Well, you can't forbid love. That doesn't really work. But behavior, that can work, and people go on with their lives and all that. I mean, you got to give them a good reason, of course. Okay. Cleonomus from his earliest years had been looked upon as a youth of very great promise, yet he gave not his son any kind or hopeful answer in the case, but coldly told him that he would consider what he could honestly and honorably to do in it, and so dismissed him. Archidamus, being ashamed of his want of success, forbore the company of Cleonomus, whom he usually saw several times every day. This made the friends of Sphodrius to think his case desperate, till Etemocles, one of Agesilaus' friends, discovered to them the king's mind, namely that he abhorred the fact, but yet he thought Sphodrius a gallant man, such as the Commonwealth much wanted at that time, for Agesilaus used to talk thus concerning the case out of a desire to gratify his son, and now Cleonomus quickly understood that Archidamus had been true to him in using all his interests with his father, and Sphodrius' friend ventured to be forward in his defense. The truth is that Agesilaus was excessively fond of his children, and that is to him the story belongs that when they were little ones he used to make a horse of a stick and ride with them, and being caught at this sport by a friend he desired him not to mention it till he himself were the father of children. Meanwhile, Sphodrius being acquitted, the Athenians betook themselves to arms, and Agesilaus fell into disgrace with the people, since to gratify the whims of a boy he had been willing to pervert justice and make the city accessory to the crimes of private men, whose most unjustifiable actions had broken the peace of Greece. He also found his colleague Clembratus little inclined to the Theban war, so that it became necessary for him to waive the privilege of his age, which before he had claimed, and to lead the army himself into Boeotia, which he did with a variety of success, sometimes conquering and sometimes conquered, insomuch that receiving a wound in battle, he was reproached by Antiochus that the Thebans had paid him well for the lessons he had given them in fighting, and indeed they were now grown far better soldiers than ever they had been, being so continually kept in training by the frequency of the Lacedaemonian expeditions against them, out of the foresight which it was that anciently Lycurgus in 3 several laws forbade them to make any wars with the same nation, as this would be to instruct their enemies in the art of it. Meanwhile, the allies of Spara were not a little discontented at Agesilaus, because this war was commenced not upon any fair public ground of quarrel, but merely out of his private hatred to the Thebans, and they complained with indignation that they, being the majority of the army, should from year to year be thus exposed to danger and hardship here and there, and at the will of a few persons. It was at this time, we are told, that Agesilaus, to obviate the objection, devised this expedient to show the allies were not the greater number. He gave orders that all the allies of whatever country should sit down promiscuously on one side, and all the Lacedaemonians on the other, which being done, he commanded a herald to proclaim that all the potters of both divisions should stand out, that then all the blacksmiths, then all the masons, next the carpenters, and so he went through all the handicrafts. By this time almost all the allies were risen, but of the Lacedaemonians not a man, they being by law forbidden to learn any mechanical business. And now Agesilaus laughed and said, "You see, my friends, how many more soldiers we send out than you do." When he brought back his army from Boeotia through Megara, as he was going up to the magistrate's office in the Acropolis, he was suddenly seized with pain and cramp in his sound leg, and a great swelling and inflammation ensued. He was treated by a Syracusan physician, who let him blood below the ankle. This soon eased his pain, but then the blood could not be stopped, till the loss of it brought on fainting and swooning. At length, with much trouble, he stopped it. Agesilaus was carried home to Sparta in a very weak condition, and did not recover strength enough to appear in the field for a long time after. Meanwhile, the Spartan fortune was but ill. They received many losses both by sea and land, but the greatest was that at Tegora, for when the first time they were beaten by the Thebans in a set battle, all the Greeks were accordingly disposed to a general peace, and to that end ambassadors came to Sparta. Among these was Epaminondas the Theban, famous at that time for his philosophy and learning, but he had not yet given proof of his capacity as a general. He, seeing all the others crouch to Agesilaus and court favor with him, alone maintained the dignity of an ambassador, and with that freedom that became his character, made his speech in behalf not of Thebes only, from whence he came, but of all Greece, remonstrating that Sparta alone grew great by war, to the distress and suffering of all her neighbors. He urged that a peace should be made upon just and equal terms, such as alone would be a lasting one, which could not otherwise be done than by reducing all to equality. Agesilaus, perceiving all the other Greeks to give much attention to the discourse, and to be pleased with it, presently asked him whether he thought it a part of this justice and equality that the Boeotian towns should enjoy their independence. Epaminondas instantly and without wavering asked him in return whether he thought it just and equal that the Laconian towns should enjoy theirs. Agesilaus started from his seat and bade him once for all speak and say whether or not Boeotia should be independent. And when Epaminondas replied once again with the same inquiry whether Laconia should be so, Agesilaus was so enraged that, availing himself of the pretext, he immediately struck the name of the Thebans out of the league, and declared war against them. With the rest of the Greeks he made a peace, and dismissed them with this saying, that what could be peaceably adjusted should, what was otherwise incurable, must be committed to the success of war, it being a thing of too great difficulty to provide for all things by treaty. Now, you notice in the tarot card for the Justice how fierce looking the scales are, right? Like in the Crowley Thoth tarot. I mean, and this stories like this could be why. The ephors upon this dispatched their orders to Cleombrotus, who was at that time in Phocis, to march directly into Boeotia, and at the same time sent to their allies for aid. The Confederates were very tardy in their business and unwilling to engage, but as yet they feared the Spartans too much to dare to refuse, and although many portents and prodigies of ill presage, which I have mentioned in the life of Epaminondas, had appeared, and though Prothous, the Laconian, did all he could to hinder it. Yet Agesilaus would needs go forward, and prevailed so that the war was decreed. He thought the present juncture of affairs very advantageous for their revenge, the rest of Greece being wholly free, and the Thebans excluded from the peace, but that this war was undertaken more upon passion than judgment, the event may prove, for the treaty was finished but the 14th of Scurophorion, and the Lacedaemonians received their great overthrow at Leuctra on the 5th of Hecatombaon. Within 20 days there fell at that time 1,000 Spartans, and Cleombrotus, their king, all around him the bravest men of the nation, particularly the beautiful youth, Cleonomus, the son of Sphodrias, who was thrice struck down at the feet of the king, and as often rose, but was slain in the last.